Hello everybody. Today we're going to talk a little bit about research. Students mostly have some familiarity with conducting research for different types of writing assignments. So for instance, for informative papers in which you might just be required to synthesize information on a particular topic, or perhaps for something like an argumentative paper where you are trying to convince your audience of a particular argument and you need your own thoughts and opinions but also some research to back up that information. But how do you go about conducting research for a paper that requires you to analyze a work of literature? Often when we write about literature, we might just be asked to provide our own interpretation of a particular text, our own analysis, but sometimes you may also be required to incorporate research into your literary analysis paper. So that's specifically what we're going to talk about doing today. So when we're writing about literature, we have three different places that we can potentially draw from for our analysis. The first of those obviously is quotes from the actual literary text itself. Now, you may be writing about just one work of literature, you may be writing about more than one. So let's say, for instance, that you're comparing two short stories. So you would be taking quotes, information from the text itself. There are many literary analysis essays that use only that. But if you have to use any outside sources, then these are the other two options that you also have. You can take information from an academic source that is about that literary work. Now, as always with research, you want to avoid anything that's like a .com, .net. You want to stick to .org, .gov, .edu for websites, but you can also find scholarly journal articles from your library databases or books as well. And then your third option is information from also an academic source, but it's not about the literary work at all. It's actually about something else that fits in with some aspect of your analysis of the literary work. Now, the best way to understand what these actually look like is to see them used in an example of an analysis of a particular work of literature. So that's what we're going to do now. Here we have a thesis about a couple of works of literature from the 1700s by an author named Eliza Haywood. And the one we're going to be focusing on is a short novel named Phantomina. So we're going to see how this particular graduate student has utilized all three forms of information that we were talking about. Now, there's a scene in this story in which the main character experiences rape. And the student here is trying to demonstrate where that takes place and its significance. So let's take a look at the actual text. It is not surprising that Beauplaisir would take any liberties he likes with a woman he believes to be a prostitute. However, when she reaches the point of being alone with Beauplaisir, the protagonist realizes that she is undoubtedly going to be raped. Shocked at the apprehension of really losing her honor, she struggled all she could. She told him that she was a virgin, and had assumed this manner of behavior only to engage him, but that he little regarded. So what the student has done here is introduce the idea that the character is raped in the scene, and then pulls a quote from the actual text to demonstrate that that is in fact the case. And you'll notice here the student uses this ... the ellipses. That's something that you're able to do if you'd like to. Sometimes you don't need the entire quote. If you only need a part of it and there's part of it that you can remove without changing the meaning, then go ahead and do that. You only need the parts that are actually useful for making your point. Now, when she's done with a quote, it says, essentially, Beauplaisir rapes her, and then continues to explain how the quote is relevant. So you can't just introduce a quote and say, there you go, there's proof. You have to actually let your reader understand how that quote, in fact, serves your point. So the student elaborates, it is no less a rape simply because the lady is herself enraptured. She attempts to resist his advances, and he takes her by force. Now, what's coming up next is also a quote, but this one is not from the story Phantomina itself. So let's take a look at the next quote. The heroine learns she cannot simply follow personal desires without regard to the patriarchal social structures that largely define the public arena in which those desires exist. So notice this is not from Haywood. This is from a different author. So this is a quote from a text that is about the Phantomina story. So a literature academic wrote about the story. The student has found that article, and something that author says coincides with the argument that she's trying to make about this scene. So she goes ahead and incorporates that quote into her analysis as well, just making sure that it all fits together with what she's saying, the quotes she's pulling from the text. It all has to flow. Once again, the student can't just leave it at that. You can't just end your paragraph with a quote and let the other author do the talking for you, or let the literature do the talking for you. You need to still elaborate. So when she says however here, that is in relation to the quote from the previous author, but is now her point. However, she also realizes that what is done, and she resolves to continue her flirtation with Beauplaisir and perhaps to enjoy him more during future encounters. So now we've seen how the student takes information from two different types of sources, the literature itself and an article that is about the literature. But we also discussed the third option, which is taking information from a source that has literally nothing to do with the literature you're trying to analyze. So let's see how the student goes about doing that. In the paragraph that we just looked at, she goes a little bit into how the idea of prostitution fits in to the story and to the rape scene in particular. And so she's going to now, in her new chapter, elaborate on that idea. Haywood's choice of a prostitute for the protagonist's first disguise is significant. So now the quote begins here. In the 18th century, prostitution was widespread and increasing. London alone, it is thought, had over 10,000 prostitutes. Although quite a few returned sooner or later to a more regular course of life, prostitution was most certainly rampant. Prostitutes actually had more freedom than single women of a higher social standing, and although they were wage earners, earnings were almost certainly higher than for most other female occupations. So what has the student done here? She has found an article that has nothing to do with Phantomina. Probably the person who wrote this article has never even heard of the story Phantomina. But it is relevant to what she's writing about because it talks about prostitution in that specific period in that same country that the text itself, the story, is set in. So this is relevant for her argument. And when she quotes from it, there's a couple of things she's doing. She is using the ellipsis, which we had talked about before, but there are also moments in which she closes the quote, puts in a few of her own words, and then opens the quote again. So you can play with quotes in that way as long as you're not changing the meaning of where you're drawing that information from. Then you're fine to take a little piece out, to add some of your own words, as long as you can differentiate which words are from the article and which words are your own. Now, as we've previously discussed, once again, she cannot just close out with a quote from another article. She has to elaborate on it. So let's look and see at how she does that. So it seems that the protagonist, through performing a masquerade as a prostitute, in other words, she's pretending to be a prostitute in the story, puts herself in a much more likely position to get what she wants, the naughty attentions of Beauplaisir, than the position she would be in as her true self. So that about covers it. If you are asked to include any research in your literary analysis, then aside from information from the actual literature, you can include information from articles about the literature or articles about something that is related to your specific analysis of it. Good luck.